I really like how um, post World War II, that is, most governments around the world have come to paint themselves in the image of being economic beings, as if the state that rules over a people, a government that governs a people, can ever be an economic being. Economics and the dynamics of poverty and wealth are very secondary to the human experience because they are gradual and slow. Generally, when poverty strikes all of a sudden, as in the times of the Great Depression induced by a market fall and so forth, then perhaps people might resist it with all their hearts. But because poverty comes slowly and steadily, and so does wealth, it is very difficult to blame or credit someone in particular, let alone a government, which is a very big body, generally very distributed, and with powers that are so diversified. It's not really possible to give it credit or give it blame for economic outcomes. And the people in government realize that. The government might be the biggest spender and the biggest earner in a country, but the one thing that the government cannot do is somehow induce permanent long term growth with only its own spending. It's something that originates organically out of the will of the people. And the problem with all of that is that the governments still try to paint themselves in this innocent image of being economic beings, purely economic beings. Governments cannot be purely economic beings. Governments are the final culprits, as I like to put it, the final criminals. When one crime is committed, to punish that criminal, another criminal will be born. And to punish that criminal, another criminal will be born. Suppose there happens to be a murder somewhere. That's the first crime, that's the initial crime. Then, to exact revenge upon that murderer, someone else kills this murderer, and then they become the murderer. But the point is that interests were associated with the first murderer. The first murderer also had a family and also had friends, also had financial interests, debtors, and creditors who are now at a loss because the person they knew has now been killed. And perhaps the actions of the first individual were justified to at least some of his or her family and friends. These people will then seek revenge and justice. And then the first murderer's murderer will then be to blame, and the best kind of justice that they would want is revenge, and they would want him killed. The government in this chain of crime is the final criminal, because when the government kills someone, when the government exacts a certain punishment on someone, nobody can punish the government for it, at least not equally. When the government kills, nobody kills the government, because first of all, there is no one man or woman who can be called government, but also because even if one man or woman would be the entire government, they would not be punished. They are the supreme law. That is how any and all governments must be understood. They are the final criminals. And the will of the people must always be so directed that the final crime committed by such final criminals, the final government, must always be mitigated to an extent that only fear of that final punishment is preserved and no final punishment is actually given. When you understand the world in this way, clemency becomes the most important aspect of life, and at least in government. And in defense of those governments that have let their people rot in poverty, I must say that no other thing could better have been done. All those governments which have a direct representation, which have been elected because the people have chosen them, always have some sympathy towards the economic woes and worries of their people. And whatever it is that they are doing, I'm pretty sure they're doing their best. There are things they can be blamed for, and there are things they cannot be blamed for. And again, it is not a redeeming quality that the government cannot be directly blamed or credited for economic successes or failures of a country. But I must say that The most that an economic institution can do, or the government as an economic institution can do, is spend. And spending gets lost very quickly. A people are either corrupt or they are not corrupt, and mostly the people will be corrupt. Whatever money is spent will be lost to corruption left and right. It's always going to be the case. It does not depend on will. The only good governments that end up spending money on their people are those that feel that spending money would help. They act in some way and then they hope that the people are not corrupt enough that they will eat up all the money spent. But it still happens nonetheless at times and doesn't happen on other occasions. Economics is a matter of luck. A country can be poor or rich depending on however God favors it. But the one thing that the government must always be put to blame for is the essence and the nature and the brutality of the final crime. If your government is a final criminal that has clemency at the core of its heart, you are living in a good country. Otherwise, man, otherwise there are things to think about. That's all.